The morning of November 18, 1942, began like every other combat patrol over Guadalcanal, until it didn't. Lieutenant Junichi Sasai's formation of 9 Zeros lifted from Rabaul at dawn, escorting bombers toward Henderson Field. The flight was routine. Intelligence had warned of increased American fighter activity, but the reports spoke of carrier-based Wildcats, aircraft the Zero had bested dozens of times before. Sasai's pilots flew with the confidence of men who had never met their match in the air. They spotted the American fighters at 0847 hours. Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, flying wing position, saw them first. Strange silhouettes rising from Henderson Field, twin-boomed and heavy-looking, climbing through scattered clouds. His initial assessment was almost dismissive. Escort fighters, perhaps reconnaissance aircraft. The rate of climb suggested neither. Within 90 seconds, that assessment became irrelevant. The P-38 Lightnings, 16 aircraft from the 339th Fighter Squadron, weren't just climbing. They were ascending faster than the Zeros, their twin Allison engines propelling them through altitude bands the Japanese formation had just reached. By the time Sasai recognized them as fighters, the Americans had gained a 5,000-foot advantage. What happened next shattered 3 years of Japanese aerial doctrine. The Lightnings didn't engage in turning combat. They didn't maneuver for position at the Zero's altitude. Instead, they circled above like birds of prey, choosing their moment with calculated precision. Then, without warning, they dove. The first Zero disintegrated in a stream of tracer fire before its pilot could react. 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon concentrated in the Lightning's nose, delivering firepower no wing-mounted weapon system could match. The convergence was perfect, because convergence wasn't necessary. Every round traveled the same path. Sakai yanked his stick hard left, muscle memory demanding the aggressive turn that had saved him countless times before. His Zero responded beautifully, snapping into the tight radius that had made the aircraft legendary. But the P-38 that had targeted him wasn't there anymore. It had already pulled away in a climbing turn the Zero couldn't follow, accelerating to speeds Sakai's aircraft couldn't reach. Nothing that large should move like that. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get back to the story. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. 3 Zeros fell in flames. The Lightnings suffered no losses. When Sasai's surviving pilots regrouped over open water, the radio chatter revealed something more dangerous than lost aircraft. Lost confidence. The questions came in fragments, disbelief coloring every transmission. How did they climb so fast? Why couldn't we follow them in the dive? What kind of engines do they have? Back at Rabaul, Sasai's after-action report was clinical, professional, and deeply disturbing to his superiors. The Americans had introduced a fighter that operated in a dimension of aerial combat the Zero could not access. Altitude superiority, energy dominance, boom and zoom tactics executed with technological precision. The Zero's legendary maneuverability meant nothing when the enemy controlled the sky above. Japanese air supremacy, unchallenged since Pearl Harbor, had just encountered its first existential threat. And every pilot who survived that morning knew the terrible truth they would carry back to their squadrons. The rules had changed, and Japan had no answer. To understand the shock of that November morning, one must first understand the mythology Japanese pilots carried into combat. A mythology built on undeniable victories and 3 years of absolute aerial dominance. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had rewritten the rules of Pacific air combat From its first appearance over China in 1940, with a maximum speed of 332 miles, an extraordinary range exceeding 1,900 miles, and a turning radius that seemed to defy physics, the Zero represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval aviation philosophy. Agility, range, and pilot skill above all else. December 7, 1941, proved the doctrine's validity in blood and fire. Over Pearl Harbor, Zeros swept aside the few American fighters that managed to get airborne. In the Philippines, they destroyed Curtiss P-40 Warhawks on the ground and in the air with equal efficiency. Across Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, they shredded obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and outmaneuvered British Hurricanes. By March 1942, Japanese naval aviation had achieved something unprecedented in modern warfare. Unchallenged air superiority across an entire theater, spanning millions of square miles. The pilots who flew these missions became legends in their own lifetimes. Men like Saburo Sakai, who had scored 13 victories in the Borneo campaign alone. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, whose deflection shooting was considered supernatural. Tetsuzo Iwamoto, who would claim 64 aerial victories before war's end. These weren't just skilled aviators, they were the embodiment of Bushido in the sky, warriors whose confidence came from proven superiority. At low and medium altitudes, the Zero remained virtually unbeatable. Its lightweight construction, achieved by eliminating armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, gave it a power-to-weight ratio no Allied fighter could match. In a turning fight below 15,000 feet, engaging a Zero was suicide. Allied pilots learned this through brutal attrition, their tactical manuals eventually carrying a single commandment: never turn with a Zero. But the very philosophy that made the Zero dominant contained the seeds of its obsolescence. Japanese aircraft design prioritized tradition over adaptation. The Zero's performance came from radical weight reduction and pilot skill, not technological innovation. While American and British engineers experimented with superchargers, self-sealing tanks, and armor protection, Japanese designers refined what already existed, making the Zero lighter, more maneuverable, more dependent on pilot experts. This approach worked brilliantly until it didn't. By mid-1942, intelligence reports filtering back to Japanese squadrons mentioned new American fighters with peculiar characteristics: twin engines, heavy armament, exceptional high-altitude performance. Squadron commanders dismissed these reports. How could a twin-engine aircraft threaten the nimble Zero? The doctrine had no framework for understanding energy tactics, altitude dominance, or the industrial philosophy that prioritized technological superiority over pilot heroism. Japanese naval aviation had spent 3 years perfecting yesterday's war. The cracks were forming, visible to anyone willing to see them. Experienced pilots whispered concerns about American fighters that refused to engage in turning combat, that used diving attacks and speed to negate the Zero's advantages. But doctrine, reinforced by unbroken victory, doesn't change easily. And so Japanese pilots flew into late 1942 carrying confidence built on assumptions that were about to be systematically destroyed. Not by better pilots or superior tactics, but by machines designed for a kind of warfare Japan had never imagined. To understand the shock of that November morning, one must first understand the mythology Japanese pilots carried into combat, a mythology built on undeniable victories and 3 years of absolute aerial dominance. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had rewritten the rules of Pacific air combat from its first appearance over China in 1940, with a maximum speed of 332 mph, an extraordinary range exceeding 1,900 miles, and a turning radius that seemed to defy physics. The Zero represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval aviation philosophy. Agility, range, and pilot skill above all else. December 7, 1941, proved the doctrine's validity in blood and fire. Over Pearl Harbor, Zeros swept aside the few American fighters that managed to get airborne. In the Philippines, they destroyed Curtiss P-40 Warhawks on the ground and in the air with equal efficiency. Across Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, they shredded obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and outmaneuvered British Hurricanes. By March 1942, Japanese naval aviation had achieved something unprecedented in modern warfare: unchallenged air superiority across an entire theater spanning millions of square miles. The pilots who flew these missions became legends in their own lifetimes. Men like Saburo Sakai, who had scored 13 victories in the Borneo campaign alone; Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, whose deflection shooting was considered supernatural; Tetsuzo Iwamoto, who would claim 64 aerial victories before war's end. These weren't just skilled aviators, they were the embodiment of Bushido in the sky, warriors whose confidence came from proven superiority. At low and medium altitudes, the Zero remained virtually unbeatable. Its lightweight construction, achieved by eliminating armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, gave it a power-to-weight ratio no Allied fighter could match. In a turning fight below 15,000 feet, engaging a Zero was suicide. Allied pilots learned this through brutal attrition, their tactical manuals eventually carrying a single commandment: never turn with a Zero. But the very philosophy that made the Zero dominant contained the seeds of its obsolescence. Japanese aircraft design prioritized tradition over adaptation. The Zero's performance came from radical weight reduction and pilot skill, not technological innovation. While American and British engineers experimented with superchargers, self-sealing tanks, and armor protection, Japanese designers refined what already existed, making the Zero lighter, more maneuverable, more dependent on pilot expertise. This approach worked brilliantly until it didn't. By mid-1942, intelligence reports filtering back to Japanese squadrons mentioned new American fighters with peculiar characteristics: twin engines, heavy armament, exceptional high-altitude performance. Squadron commanders dismissed these reports. How could a twin-engine aircraft threaten the nimble Zero? The doctrine had no framework for understanding energy tactics, altitude dominance, or the industrial philosophy that prioritized technological superiority over pilot heroism. Japanese naval aviation had spent 3 years perfecting yesterday's war. The cracks were forming, visible to anyone willing to see them. Experienced pilots whispered concerns about American fighters that refused to engage in turning combat, that used diving attacks and speed to negate the Zero's advantages. But doctrine, reinforced by unbroken victory, doesn't change easily. And so Japanese pilots flew into late 1942 carrying confidence built on assumptions that were about to be systematically destroyed, not by better pilots or superior tactics, but by machines designed for a kind of warfare Japan had never imagined. The B-17 flying fortresses droned toward their targets over Buin on November 18, 1942, their formations tight and disciplined. Above them, climbing in loose pairs, the P-38 Lightnings of the 339th Fighter Squadron maintained their escort, 16 twin-boomed silhouettes that Japanese spotters initially mistook for additional bombers. That misidentification cost lives within minutes. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima led the Japanese intercept force, 9 Zeros climbing, to engage what they assumed was a standard American bomber formation, with perhaps a handful of Wildcat escorts. The tactical brief had been routine: attack the bombers, brush aside the escorts, return to Rabaul. Standard procedure for pilots who had executed similar missions dozens of times. Then Nakajima saw the bombers accelerate and climb. By the time his formation reached 18,000 feet, an altitude where the Zero still performed adequately, The P-38s had already established position at 23,000 feet. The Americans weren't maneuvering to engage. They were waiting, circling like sharks above prey, choosing their moment with methodical precision. The first attack came without warning. Two Lightnings rolled inverted and dove, accelerating through 400 mph in seconds. Nakajima's wingman never had time to react. The concentrated nose-mounted firepower struck like a sledgehammer, and the Zero came apart in a spray of burning fuel and aluminum. Before Nakajima could process what had happened, the P-38s were gone, climbing away at angles and speeds his aircraft couldn't match, already repositioning for the next pass. This wasn't dogfighting. This was execution. American pilots called it boom and zoom. Dive from superior altitude, fire a concentrated burst, then use the accumulated speed to climb back to safety before the enemy could respond. The tactic exploited every advantage the P-38 possessed and negated every strength the Zero relied upon. Nakajima attempted the standard counter, a hard defensive turn to force an overshoot. His Zero snapped into its legendary turning radius, a maneuver that had saved him countless times against Wildcats and P-40s. But the Lightning pilot didn't follow. He simply extended away in level flight, his twin engines pulling him beyond the Zero's maximum speed, then pitched up into a climb Nakajima's aircraft couldn't hope to follow. 30 seconds later, the same P-38 was above him again, repositioning for another attack. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. At altitude, the Zero's controls became sluggish, its engine starved for oxygen. Its legendary maneuverability reduced to labored turns that bled energy. The P-38, meanwhile, rated in its element. Turbo-supercharged engines maintaining full power, hydraulically boosted controls remaining responsive, speed and altitude providing infinite tactical options. Saburo Sakai, witnessing the engagement from a defensive position, later described the feeling as helplessness incarnate. We could not climb to them. We could not dive away from them. We could not turn tightly enough to threaten them. They controlled everything: the altitude, the speed, the moment of engagement. We were fighting their battle, not ours. By the time the surviving Zeros broke off and fled toward Rabaul, 3 aircraft had been lost. The P-38s suffered no damage. The after-action reports filtering back to Japanese headquarters carried a message no commander wanted to hear. Altitude supremacy had changed hands, and with it, control of the Pacific sky. The confrontation between the P-38 Lightning and the A-6M-0 wasn't merely a contest between two aircraft, it was a collision between incompatible philosophies of aerial warfare, with physics serving as the ultimate arbiter. Japanese naval aviation had built its doctrine on a single principle: the turning fight. Every aspect of the Zero's design served this philosophy. Weight was ruthlessly minimized, armor removed, fuel tanks left unprotected, structural components pared to the absolute minimum. The result was an aircraft that could outturn anything in the sky at low to medium altitude, where air density provided sufficient power and control authority. But physics doesn't negotiate with philosophy. The Zero's Nakajima Sakae 12 engine, producing 950 horsepower at sea level, lost power exponentially with altitude. At 15,000 feet, output dropped to approximately 850 horsepower. At 20,000 feet, barely 750 horsepower remained. By 25,000 feet, the engine was essentially starving, producing perhaps 600 horsepower, insufficient to maintain the energy required for aggressive maneuvering. The P-38's turbo-supercharged Allison engines operated on different physics entirely. The turbo-superchargers compressed thin, high-altitude air back to sea-level density, maintaining engine power output to 40,000 feet. Where the Zero weakened with altitude, the Lightning strengthened, its power-to-weight ratio actually improving as the air thinned and drag decreased. The tactical implications were devastating. At 25,000 feet, a Zero pilot pushing his throttle to maximum could barely maintain level flight while turning. A P-38 pilot at the same altitude had sufficient power for vertical climbs, high-speed turns, and sustained energy maneuvers. The battle wasn't between pilots, it was between machines operating in entirely different performance envelopes. The diving equation proved equally unforgiving. Japanese pilots discovered that the Zero, optimized for low-speed maneuverability, became dangerous at high speed. Above 300 mph, the aircraft's light construction became a liability. Control surfaces stiffened dramatically as aerodynamic forces increased. Pilots reported needing both hands on the stick to execute even gentle maneuvers. Above 350 mph, the Zero suffered from control compression so severe that recovery from high-speed dives required hundreds of feet of altitude and maximum physical effort. Some pilots didn't recover at all. The airframe would fail structurally before the pilot could regain control. The P-38, conversely, was designed for high-speed flight. Its hydraulically boosted controls remained responsive, approaching 500 mph. Pilots could dive at extreme speeds, fire with accuracy, then extend away or pull into vertical climbs that would have torn a Zero apart. Speed wasn't just an advantage. It was a weapon the Lightning could deploy at will while the Zero feared it. By early 1943, captured Japanese documents revealed a stark admission from their own technical analysts. The Zero was designed for combat conditions that no longer exist. The Americans fight a vertical war we cannot reach. Our aircraft excels at horizontal combat they refuse to engage in. Japan had optimized for elegance and tradition. America had optimized for physics and industrial reality. And in the skies above the Pacific, there was no negotiating with thermodynamics, no appealing to Bushido when engine power failed at altitude, no warrior spirit that could overcome control compression in a high-speed dive. The Zero was fighting yesterday's war. The P-38 had already moved on to tomorrow's. By early 1943, something more dangerous than aircraft losses was spreading through Japanese naval aviation squadrons, fear rooted in technological helplessness. The letters and diaries recovered after the war reveal a psychological transformation that mirrored the tactical one. Pilots who had written confidently about their superiority in late 1942 were expressing doubt, frustration, and a creeping sense of doom by spring 1943. Petty Officer First Class Takeo Tanemizu, a veteran with 11 victories, wrote to his family in March, "We hear them before we see them, that deep growl of twin engines high above. We know they are there, choosing when to strike. We cannot reach them. We can only wait and hope they choose someone else." This is not the war we trained for. The psychological impact transcended individual fear. It represented the collapse of doctrinal certainty that had sustained Japanese aviation since China. Pilots trained to seek combat aggressively were now being instructed, quietly, unofficially, to avoid engagements with P-38s unless holding overwhelming numerical advantage or superior position. Even Japan's elite aces began modifying their tactics in ways that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Saburo Sakai, with over 60 claimed victories, admitted in post-war interviews that by mid-1943, he avoided high-altitude combat entirely when P-38s were reported in the area. It was no longer possible for Zero fighters to successfully engage the P-38s except under the most unusual conditions, which unhappily seldom presented themselves. This admission from Japan's most famous ace carried devastating weight among the pilot community. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, whose deflection shooting was considered supernatural, developed a reputation for tactical repositioning, a polite term for refusing combat when Lightnings held altitude advantage. Squadron mates whispered that even the devil knew when physics made courage irrelevant. The situation grew catastrophic with the arrival of new pilots. Japan's pilot training program, which had produced the elite aviators of 1941 and 42, was collapsing under the weight of attrition it could never sustain. Training time dropped from 2 years to less than 6 months. Pilots arrived at combat squadrons with barely 200 hours of flight time, a fraction of what their American counterparts received, and virtually no instruction in high-altitude combat or energy tactics. These replacements faced P-38s, flown by increasingly experienced American pilots who had refined boom and zoom tactics to lethal perfection. The results were slaughter. Squadron records from Rabaul in April 1943 document entire flights of replacement pilots being destroyed in their first combat encounters. New pilots, trained in traditional dogfighting doctrine, would attempt to turn with diving lightnings and die before completing the maneuver. Others, recognizing the altitude disadvantage, would attempt to dive away, only to discover the P-38 could dive faster, pull out lower, and climb back to advantage before the Zero could recover. Commander Masatake Okumiya, analyzing combat reports at Rabaul headquarters, wrote in his war diary, "We are sending children to fight engineers. Every report demands greater fighting spirit, more aggressive tactics. But spirit cannot generate engine power at 25,000 feet. Aggression cannot overcome physics. We are refusing to admit what every pilot knows. We are fighting with obsolete weapons against an enemy that improves daily." The psychological collapse was complete. Japanese pilots no longer believed they could win encounters with P-38s. They believed they could only survive them, and survival depended on the Americans' mercy, not Japanese skill. April 18, 1943, proved that the P-38 Lightning wasn't merely a superior fighter. It was a strategic weapon capable of reaching anywhere in the Pacific theater with lethal precision. American codebreakers had intercepted and decrypted Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's travel itinerary. Japan's most brilliant naval strategist would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18th, arriving at 09:45 hours. The opportunity was unprecedented, and the mission seemed impossible. The target would be 435 miles from Henderson Field, traveling with fighter escort over open ocean requiring pinpoint navigation. No Allied fighter had the range, endurance, or performance envelope to execute such an intercept. Except one. Major John Mitchell led 18 P-38s from the 339th Fighter Squadron on what would become Operation Vengeance. Each Lightning carried 2 310-gallon drop tanks, extending their already impressive range to the extreme edge of possibility. The flight plan called for precise timing. Depart Henderson at 0725, fly at wave-top altitude to avoid radar detection, navigate 435 miles over featureless ocean using dead reckoning and compass headings, arrive at the interception point at exactly 0935, 10 minutes before Yamamoto's aircraft began its descent. The margin for error was 0. Mitchell's formation flew at 50 feet above the Pacific, their twin engines skimming the wave tops for over an hour and a half. Navigation was handled by Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber, who had to account for wind drift, fuel consumption, and timing without the benefit of landmarks or radio navigation aids. 1 degree off course, and they would miss the interception entirely. At 0934 hours, 1 minute early, they spotted Yamamoto's flight. 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers were descending toward Bougainville, escorted by 6 Zeros. The Japanese formation was precisely where American intelligence had predicted, flying exactly the route decoded from intercepted messages. The shock of seeing American fighters 435 miles from their base, fighters that shouldn't possess such range, paralyzed the Japanese escort for crucial seconds. Lanfear and Barber broke toward the bombers, while the remaining P-38s engaged the Zero escort. The attack was surgical. Yamamoto's aircraft, hit by Barber's concentrated nose-mounted firepower, crashed into the jungle. The second bomber fell moments later. The Zeros, caught at low altitude where they theoretically held advantage, were overwhelmed by Lightnings that had retained enough fuel and energy to fight after a 435-mile approach flight. The Americans lost one aircraft. Japan lost its most irreplaceable strategic mind. The psychological impact on Japanese command exceeded even the tactical shock their pilots had experienced. Yamamoto had been traveling with 6 Zero escorts, elite pilots flying Japan's premier fighter. Yet American P-38s had penetrated that defense, executed their mission with precision, and escaped. The operational planning required was staggering. Intelligence collection, cryptanalysis, navigation across open ocean, timing to the minute, and combat effectiveness after an exhausting approach flight. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, a staff officer who reviewed the mission reports, wrote, "They flew further than we thought possible, navigated with accuracy we cannot achieve, struck with timing that suggests divine knowledge, and fought successfully while we held local superiority. This is not a fighter aircraft. This is a strategic system we have no counter for." The Yamamoto interception proved what Japanese pilots already knew, but their commanders had refused to accept. The Lightning could go anywhere, strike anything, and return home, transforming aerial combat from tactical engagements into strategic operations Japan could neither predict nor prevent. By mid-1943, the war in the Pacific had become a race between American innovation and Japanese stagnation, a race Japan was losing with accelerating finality. The P-38 that dominated the skies in late 1943 bore little resemblance to the aircraft that first arrived in the Pacific. Lockheed's engineering teams, receiving constant feedback from combat pilots, implemented improvements with relentless efficiency. Each new variant addressed weaknesses and enhanced strengths based on actual battle experience. The P-38J model, arriving in August 1943, incorporated hydraulically boosted ailerons that dramatically improved roll rate, addressing one of the few areas where the Zero had maintained advantage. Improved intercooler systems increased engine reliability at high altitude. Enhanced cockpit heating solved problems that had plagued European operations. Flat, bulletproof windscreens replaced the curved versions that had caused optical distortion during gunnery passes. The P-38L, introduced in mid-1944, pushed performance even further. Uprated engines generated 1,075 horsepower, each with water injection. Improved cooling systems allowed sustained combat power at extreme altitudes. Underwing pylons enabled the Lightning to carry rockets and bombs in addition to its standard armament, transforming it from pure fighter to devastating multi-role platform. Over 10,000 P-38s would be manufactured by war's end, representing 18 distinct models of continuous refinement. American industrial philosophy treated aircraft development as an iterative process. Identify problems, engineer solutions, implement improvements, repeat. Japan's aircraft industry operated under entirely different constraints. Mitsubishi engineers recognized the Zero's obsolescence by 1943 and attempted modifications. The A6M5 model featured slightly thicker wing skins to prevent structural failure in high-speed dives, improved exhaust systems, and marginally better armor protection. These changes represented the absolute limit of what could be accomplished without complete redesign. And they weren't enough. The fundamental problem was that improving the Zero required abandoning the philosophy that made it the Zero. Adding armor meant adding weight, which reduced maneuverability. Strengthening the airframe for high-speed flight meant sacrificing range. Installing more powerful engines, which Japan's industrial base struggled to produce, meant redesigning the entire aircraft. Captain Minoru Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, admitted privately in late 1943, "We are not just facing superior aircraft. We are facing a system of continuous improvement we cannot match. Each encounter brings new American capabilities. We respond with doctrine and spirit, while they respond with engineering." The pilot quality gap widened even faster than the technological one. By late 1943, Japan was losing experienced pilots faster than any training program could replace them. The veteran aces of 1941 and 42, men with thousands of hours and dozens of victories, were irreplaceable assets being ground down through attrition. When Hiroyoshi Nishizawa died in October 1944, shot down while riding as a passenger in a transport, Japan lost tactical knowledge that couldn't be recreated in any training program. New pilots arrived at combat squadrons with barely 100 hours of flight time, having never fired their guns at a maneuvering target, never practiced high-altitude combat, never trained against the energy tactics American pilots employed as standard procedure. They faced American pilots with 400 to 600 hours of training, who had studied gun camera footage, practiced against dissimilar aircraft, and received specialized instruction in P-38 operations. The survival rate for Japanese replacement pilots in their first 5 missions approached 0. America was building better aircraft and better pilots simultaneously. Japan was losing both, and the mathematics of that divergence guaranteed only one possible outcome. By 1944, the P-38 Lightning had transcended its role as fighter aircraft and become the instrument of Japan's aerial collapse across every dimension of air warfare. Air superiority missions that once required careful planning and numerical advantage became routine sweeps where American pilots hunted with impunity. P-38 formations ranged hundreds of miles beyond their bases, challenging Japanese fighters over their own airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground and decimating any formation foolish enough to accept combat. The kill ratios told a story of systematic annihilation. 15-1, 20-1. Entire Japanese formations wiped out without American loss. Ground attack missions revealed the Lightning's devastating versatility. The same aircraft that dominated at 30,000 feet could carry 3,200 pounds of bombs or rockets for strikes against shipping, airfields, and supply depots. P-38s strafed Japanese positions with their concentrated nose-mounted firepower, each pass delivering the equivalent of a naval destroyer's broadside. Targets that had once been safe behind layers of fighter protection were now vulnerable to aircraft that could fight their way in, deliver ordnance with precision, and fight their way out. Long-range escort duties, the mission that had originally justified the Lightning's twin-engine design, became exhibitions of American industrial reach. B-17s and B-24s struck targets deep in Japanese-held territory, with P-38 escorts that could match their range and maintain combat effectiveness throughout the mission. Japanese interceptors, already struggling against Lightnings in air-to-air combat, now faced them while trying to attack bomber formations, a tactical impossibility that resulted in slaughter. The simultaneous collapse occurred across 3 dimensions. Doctrinally, Japanese tactical manuals issued in late 1943 advised pilots to avoid combat with P-38s unless holding overwhelming advantage, a complete inversion of the aggressive engagement doctrine that had defined Japanese naval aviation. Orders directing pilots to avoid the enemy represented a psychological capitulation more devastating than any battlefield loss. Spiritually, the warrior ethos that had sustained Japanese pilots through early defeats was crumbling against technological reality. Bushido demanded courage in the face of death, but courage couldn't generate engine power at altitude. Fighting spirit couldn't overcome control compression in dives. The philosophical foundation of Japanese military culture, that will and discipline could triumph over material disadvantage, was being systematically disproven in blood. Technologically, Japan's aviation industry had fallen into a death spiral from which no recovery was possible. Factories struggled to produce sufficient numbers of obsolete aircraft, while American production lines delivered ever-improving models by the thousands. The A6M50 of 1944 was marginally better than the A6M2 of 1941, while the P-38L of 1944 was a completely different weapon system than the early variants. Commander Masatake Okumiya, analyzing the strategic situation in his headquarters at Rabaul, wrote in April 1944, "We are witnessing the death of an air force in real time, not through a single catastrophic defeat, but through systematic erosion we cannot stop. Every mission loses pilots we cannot replace. Flying aircraft we cannot improve against enemies who get stronger daily. The mathematics are inescapable." Japanese pilots began referring to P-38 encounters as kamikaze, divine wind, but with bitter irony. The term that once described Japan's miraculous salvation now represented American technological supremacy, so absolute it seemed supernatural. By late 1944, Japanese air power wasn't retreating. It was disintegrating, shattered against an industrial and technological superiority that transformed every encounter into confirmation of an outcome that had become inevitable the moment the first Lightning climbed above Guadalcanal. The war ended in August 1945, but the lessons were written in the skies above the Pacific years earlier. Lessons Japanese aviators would acknowledge with the clarity that only defeat provides. Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous surviving ace, reflected in his post-war memoirs on the moment everything changed. November 18, 1942, was the day we lost the sky. We did not know it then. We told ourselves it was one engagement, one unlucky encounter. But the truth was written in the contrails of those twin-boomed fighters climbing past us, climbing to altitudes where our philosophy could not follow. The post-war testimonies reveal a painful consensus among Japanese pilots. They had been fighting with a doctrine designed for a war that no longer existed. The turning fight, the centerpiece of Japanese aerial combat training, had become irrelevant the moment American fighters refused to engage in it. Energy tactics, altitude dominance, and boom and zoom attacks weren't innovations. They were the logical application of physics to aerial combat. Japan had simply refused to accept the equation until it was too late. Commander Minoru Genda, architect of Pearl Harbor and one of Japan's most brilliant tactical minds, admitted in 1946, "We believed maneuverability was the ultimate expression of aerial combat skill." The Americans understood something deeper. Altitude is maneuverability. Speed is maneuverability. The fighter that controls the vertical dimension controls the battle. The P-38 didn't defeat the Zero through better turning. It made turning irrelevant. The A6M0 flew its last combat mission in August 1945, an aircraft designed in 1937 optimized for low-altitude dogfighting, built on a philosophy of lightweight perfection and pilot heroism. It had reigned supreme for exactly 18 months before encountering a machine that operated according to different principles entirely. Over 10,000 P-38 Lightnings were produced during the war. They claimed over 1,300 Japanese aircraft in the Pacific Theater alone, but the numbers tell only part of the story. Each victory represented not just an aircraft destroyed, but irreplaceable pilot experience lost, tactical doctrine invalidated, and philosophical certainty shattered. The Lightning's legacy extended far beyond its combat record. It established principles that would define air combat for generations. Altitude equals advantage, Speed equals survival, firepower, concentration equals lethality, and technological superiority trumps pilot skill when the performance gap grows sufficiently large. Modern fighter aircraft, F-15s, F-22s, Eurofighters, are spiritual descendants of the P-38, not the Zero. They prioritize speed, altitude performance, radar-guided weapons, and energy management. The turning fight, once considered the ultimate test of pilot skill, has become a desperation tactic employed only when all other options fail. The Zero represented the perfection of one philosophy. The Lightning represented the obsolescence of that philosophy and the birth of another. On November 18, 1942, above Guadalcanal, Japanese pilots watched American fighters climb past them into altitudes their doctrine could not reach. Their training had not prepared them for, and their aircraft could not follow. In that moment, though it would take years for the full implications to become clear, the age of the turning fight died, and the age of energy combat, technological dominance, and industrial warfare was born. Speed had become king, and Japan had built an empire on agility.